High in the forgotten reaches of the Appalachian forest, an 11-year-old boy stands beside an old cabin. His only companion is a mutt with a tattered ear. It has been 2 years since his mother left him at a gas station with $20 and a promise to return. 2 years of wandering, of surviving, and finally, of discovering this abandoned shelter nestled among ancient pines and morning mist. The cabin's roof sags dangerously. Its windows gape like hungry mouths. Yet, in the boy's eyes, something rare shines. It is not just grit, but vision. His calloused hands grip a rusty hammer found in the shed. Beside him, the dog watches with unshakable loyalty, having followed him since those first terrifying days alone. What could an abandoned child build in this wilderness, with nothing but determination and a faithful companion? Could a forgotten place become more than a shelter? Could it become a home? The $20 bill was worn now, its edges softened from countless unfoldings, the creases worn deep as ravines. The boy kept it in a small tin box beneath his mattress, a memento of the last thing his mother had given him. "Wait here, Jaime. I need to make a call and grab a few things. 20 minutes, tops." She had pressed the bill into his palm, her fingers lingering a second longer than necessary. Something in her eyes didn't match her smile. "Get yourself a snack if you want. I'll be right back." That was 2 years ago. The rural gas station was quiet on that autumn afternoon, just off the interstate where truckers sometimes stopped. The sun was warm despite the chill in the air. Jaime waited inside by the magazine rack, flipping through outdoor magazines, picturing himself a mountain man like the ones on the glossy pages. An hour passed, then two. The cashier, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes, started casting worried glances his way. "Your mama coming back soon, honey?" she finally asked. "Yes, ma'am," Jaime answered with the certainty of an 11-year-old who still believed adults kept their promises. By dusk, the cashier called the manager. They discussed calling the police in hushed tones, thinking he couldn't hear. Jaime slipped out the back door during a moment of distraction, the $20 clutched in his hand, his backpack holding little more than a change of clothes and his school lunch. He spent the first night behind the dumpsters of a nearby fast food restaurant, curled up for warmth, starting at every sound. That's where the dog found him, a scruffy stray with a tattered ear and ribs showing through a patchy coat. He approached cautiously, head low, eyes wary but somehow hopeful. Jaime offered him a piece of his sandwich, and a bond was forged in that simple exchange. He named the dog Scout that same night, whispering the name into the dog's good ear as they huddled together for warmth. The following days blurred together. Jaime was smart enough to avoid main roads and police cars. He learned to wash in gas station restrooms and to make his money stretch, shoplifting small items from convenience stores. Hating himself for the theft, but seeing no other way, he overheard two truckers in a diner talking about the mountains, about abandoned homesteads, where people could disappear if they wanted to. Something stirred inside him then. Not just hope, but a direction. The journey began that day. Town by town, Jaime made his way toward the distant blue ridges, Scout trotting faithfully by his side. They slept in culverts, abandoned cars, and forgotten barns. They ate from trash cans, occasional handouts, and Scout's surprising knack for catching small game. The $20 was spent with agonizing care. A second-hand coat when the nights grew too cold, a decent knife from a pawn shop, matches when his attempts at fire starting failed. Jaime kept the empty wallet his mother had given him for his 10th birthday, sometimes opening it at night as if he might find something new inside. He grew careful, cultivating a story for the rare interactions with adults. "My dad's just up ahead fishing," he'd say. Or, "My mom's waiting in the truck." He became skilled at looking ordinary, just another kid on an errand, unremarkable and unremembered. The mountains called to him, growing taller with each passing day, promising something he couldn't name, perhaps refuge or just distance from a world where mothers left and didn't come back. The nights were the hardest. In those silent, dark hours, the doubts would creep in like the cold. Did she mean to come back? Did something happen to her? Should he have waited longer? The questions circled like hungry wolves, kept at bay only by the warm presence of Scout beside him. "She's not coming back," he whispered to Scout one night, 6 months into their journey, the first time he had said the words aloud. The dog licked his cheek as silent tears traced paths down his face. That admission changed something in Jaime. The waiting was over. The future, whatever it was, had begun. After that, they ventured deeper into the mountains, following game trails and creek beds, guided by instinct and Scout's keen senses. And then, through a break in the pines one misty morning, they saw it. The cabin. Weathered gray planks, a sagging porch, broken windows and all. A place forgotten by the world. A place where no one would look for a boy who had learned the hardest lesson of his young life. Sometimes the only family you can count on is the one you find along the way. The map was crude, but it was functional. Jaime had started it on the back of a discarded tourist brochure, adding to it with careful marks from a stub of a pencil. A circle for the small waterfall where the drinking water was cleanest, X's marking briar patches to be avoided. Stars for spots where Scout had found rabbit warrens. The map became his lifeline in the unfamiliar terrain. The journey into the mountains tested them both. After the initial decision to go high, away from the towns and prying eyes, Jaime quickly realized how unprepared he was. His sneakers, already worn before he was abandoned, developed holes within weeks. He wrapped them with strips torn from his spare shirt, making a mental note to search for better footwear in the scattered hunting blinds they occasionally found. Food was his most pressing concern. A constant, gnawing hunger had knotted Jaime's stomach for the first few weeks. He watched Scout carefully, learning as the dog sniffed out edible plants and roots. Through cautious trial and error, Jaime slowly built a mental catalog. Blackberries in sunlit clearings, mushrooms to be avoided, nuts that were worth the effort of cracking them open. "Good boy," Jaime whispered one evening, after Scout dropped a freshly killed rabbit at his feet. The dog's coat had begun to fill out, his ribs no longer visible. Jaime looked at the rabbit, realizing he had no idea how to prepare it. His hands trembled as he used his knife, following instinct and the dim memory of nature shows. That night, the taste of meat roasted over their small fire was the most satisfying meal of his young life. Water was easier to find, but it carried its own risks. After 2 days of stomach cramps from drinking directly from a stagnant pool, Jaime learned to seek out running water, eventually fashioning a crude filter from layers of sand, charcoal from his fires, and the cleanest cloth he had. The weather became their most unpredictable adversary. Spring thunderstorms rolled through the mountains with frightening speed. During one particularly violent squall, they huddled under a rock overhang as lightning split a nearby pine. The thunder was so loud that Scout pressed against him, trembling. Jaime covered the dog's good ear and whispered reassurances he didn't quite believe himself. They rarely encountered large wildlife, but a memorable sighting of a black bear and her cubs in a meadow sent them on a 2-hour detour. The warning rattle of a snake froze Jaime mid-step on a narrow trail, Scout's low growl alerting him just in time. Each encounter added new marks to his map, new wisdom to his journey. Sleep came easier as the weeks passed. The sounds of the forest, once terrifying, became a familiar lullaby. The whisper of wind through the pine needles, the distant call of owls, the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures. Jaime no longer woke with a start at every snapped twig. The warm weight of Scout against his back, the dog's ears constantly twitching at sounds beyond human hearing, provided more security than locks and doors ever had. They had fallen into a rhythm, walking for most of the day, stopping to forage or explore promising spots, making camp before the darkness fell completely. Jaime's legs had grown strong, his skin tanned and weathered beyond his years. The softness of childhood had been carved away by necessity, revealing a leaner, more capable form. The mountains held secrets they revealed slowly. A hidden valley blanketed in wildflowers. A circle of stones that might have been a long-ago fire pit. A bluff that caught the sunset in a blaze of orange. Jaime added each discovery to his map, creating not just a guide, but a record of his growing intimacy with this wild place. It was Scout who found the trail that led them to the ridge overlooking the cabin. The dog darted ahead, returning with the excited yelps that Jaime had learned to recognize as a discovery. Following him, Jaime pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel and found himself on a rocky outcrop. Below, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth pines, was the cabin. Even from a distance, its disrepair was obvious. The roof was partially caved in, the windows dark and empty, the stone chimney missing rocks near the top. But it was undeniably man-made, a structure with walls and the promise of shelter. Jaime stood motionless, absorbing the sight after months of constant movement, temporary shelters, and uncertain futures. The cabin represented something he had stopped allowing himself to imagine, a place to stay. The kerosene lamp cast a warm, flickering glow that pushed back the shadows but couldn't quite reach the corners of the cabin. Jaime had found it buried beneath fallen roof beams, the glass chimney miraculously intact. A small amount of fuel sloshed in its base, a forgotten gift from the cabin's former inhabitants. His approach to the structure had been cautious. Jaime circled it twice, Scout padding silently at his heels, before he dared to step onto the rotted porch. Each board groaned alarmingly under his weight. The door hung askew on a single hinge, swinging open at his touch with a low, mournful sigh. The inside revealed itself slowly as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. A single room, perhaps 20 feet square. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth choked with rubble from the collapsed chimney stones. What might have been a table lay in a heap in the center, its legs splayed like a fallen animal. Along one wall, a crude countertop remained, above which shelves tilted precariously. A narrow ladder in the corner suggested a loft above, though several rungs were missing. "Hello?" Jaime called out reflexively, his voice sounding small in the empty space. Scout sniffed diligently along the baseboards, occasionally sneezing at the stirred-up dust. The first hour was spent clearing a small corner near the fireplace. Jaime dragged out pieces of rotted furniture, stepping through cobwebs and disturbing mice that scurried into hidden crevices. Scout joined the hunt enthusiastically, emerging once with a limp rodent in his jaws, looking pleased with himself. A small cupboard revealed unexpected treasures. a dented saucepan with only a few holes in it, a fork with 2 tines remaining, and a stack of mildewed newspapers dated from 15 years prior. Most valuable of all was the lamp, which Jaime cleaned with reverence before daring to light it as darkness fell. The fireplace, thankfully, appeared to be in good condition despite the damaged chimney. Using fallen branches gathered from around the cabin, Jaime built a small fire, coaxing it to life with his dwindling supply of matches. The smoke billowed out at first, then found its way up the flue as the draft was established. The warmth was immediate and welcome, a luxury after months of sleeping beside open campfires. They ate the last of a rabbit caught 2 days before, the meat tough but satisfying. Scout curled up nearby, his eyes reflecting the firelight, occasionally lifting his head at a sound from the surrounding woods. Night in the mountains possessed a quality all its own, a stark contrast to the cities Jaime had passed through. Here there was no distant hum of traffic, no artificial glow bleeding into the sky, no chorus of human voices. Instead, the forest came alive with its own symphony. An owl hooted eerily nearby, answered by another farther off. Something, a raccoon perhaps, scrabbled at the cabin's exterior, then moved on when it found no food. The wind spoke a different language in the pines that surrounded his new shelter, one that was somehow both mournful and comforting. Sounds that once would have terrified Jaime now formed a familiar backdrop. Still, the cabin groaned and settled in ways that kept him on edge. Each new creak of board contracting in the cold night air, each rustle of unseen creatures in the walls, demanded to be catalogued and assessed. Scout's reactions became his barometer. If the dog's ears merely twitched, the sound was harmless. If he rose to his feet, Jaime tensed, ready to act. Sleep came in fits and starts. The novelty of having walls and a roof, even a partial one, was both a comfort and strangely restrictive after so many nights in the open. Jaime arranged his thin sleeping bag on the relatively clean floor, using his pack as a pillow. Scout settled beside him, a living, warm anchor in the unfamiliar space. In the deepest hours of the night, Jaime woke with a start. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The lantern had gone out, but moonlight filtered through the broken sections of the roof, casting silver patterns across the floor. Scout slept soundly, his paws twitching in some canine dream. Propping himself up on an elbow, Jaime surveyed what he could see of his shelter in the ghostly light. Despite its state of decay and obvious, prolonged abandonment, something stirred within him. It wasn't hope, exactly. That was still too fragile an emotion to trust. It was possibility. For the first time since he'd watched his mother drive away, Jaime allowed himself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. When the first light of dawn pierced the cabin's many chinks, it illuminated the boy and his dog, curled together in a corner of what could, with time and work, become a home. The fishing line felt alien in Jaime's hands, so different from the rough bark and stone he had grown accustomed to. He'd found it coiled in the bottom of a drawer, along with 3 tarnished hooks and a small metal tin that might have once held bait. The discovery sent a surge of excitement through him, a tool that could provide consistent food if he could learn to use it properly. His first attempts in the nearby creek yielded nothing but frustration and wet feet. The line tangled, and the makeshift rod, a straight, stripped branch, felt awkward in his hands. He watched the shadows of fish darting beneath the surface, tantalizingly close yet unreachable. "We just have to be patient," he told Scout, who waited on the bank, head cocked in canine curiosity. His mother used to say, Good things come to those who wait. The memory surfaced unbidden, and with it, a sharp pang. He pushed them both away, focusing on the gentle rush of water over stone. On the third day, he caught his first fish, a modest trout that nonetheless represented a monumental victory. He shouted with joy, startling birds from the nearby trees. That night, they feasted. The next day, he caught two more, smaller, but a welcome addition to their diet of foraged greens and the occasional rabbit brought down by Scout. The cabin itself demanded constant attention. Each morning revealed new challenges. A section of floor too rotten to safely walk on. A corner where rainwater pooled during storms. Holes in the walls that invited curious wildlife. Jaime tackled each problem with the limited tools at his disposal. A rusty hammer found in the remains of a tool shed. Nails carefully pried from collapsed sections and straightened for reuse, and salvaged, repurposed planks. His hands, once softened by school life and video games, grew calloused. Splinters became so common he barely noticed them anymore. His muscles ached every night, but it was a satisfying ache, proof of the work done. Water had been his first priority. The creek was a quarter-mile from the cabin, too far to haul sufficient quantities for daily use. After observing how rain behaved on the partial roof, Jaime devised a collection system using a tarp he found under the cabin's porch, stretched at an angle to funnel rainwater into the dented cooking pot. During a heavy storm, this simple innovation collected enough water to last for several days. Food storage presented its own challenges. Without refrigeration, fish and meat had to be consumed quickly or preserved. Through painful trial and error, Jaime discovered that smoking the meat over a low, smoldering fire of green wood extended its use by several days. A cool, dry corner of the cabin became the larder, where he stored his growing collections of foraged nuts and berries, dried mushrooms deemed safe after careful testing, and the smoked remnants of his protein sources. The forest, initially an adversary to be survived, gradually revealed itself as a provider. Jaime learned which plants offered remedies. Willow bark, chewed for his headaches. Jewelweed crushed and applied to the inevitable encounters with poison ivy. He discovered which trees provided the best firewood and which stones held their heat the longest when placed around the fire at night. Scout proved invaluable in ways Jaime hadn't anticipated. The dog's hearing offered an early warning of approaching wildlife. A low growl for potential predators and a different, excited yip for prey animals. His nose led them to patches of berries hidden in the undergrowth, to mushrooms Jaime might have overlooked. And most importantly, his unwavering presence kept the loneliness at bay. A loneliness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm the boy in the quiet moments. Their days settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for repairing the cabin. Afternoons were for foraging and fishing. Evenings were for rest and planning. Jaime began to notch a stick to keep track of the days, then the weeks. He watched the subtle changes in his environment, the shifting angle of the sunlight, the emergence of new plants, the altered behavior of the wildlife, and adjusted his routines accordingly. At night, by the light of the carefully rationed lantern or the fire, he would sometimes speak aloud, sharing the day's accomplishments with Scout or with the empty room. The sound of his own voice had become important, a reminder that he was still human, despite his growing affinity with the wild. "We're doing all right, aren't we, boy?" he asked Scout one evening as they sat on the partially repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in fading gold. The dog leaned against his leg, offering warmth and a silent agreement. For the first time in a very long time, Jaime felt something close to contentment. He wasn't just surviving, he was beginning to live. The rain began softly, a light tapping on what was left of the cabin roof. Jaime barely noticed at first, preoccupied with sorting the day's haul of berries. Scout lay nearby, happily gnawing on a deer bone, the remains of an animal they had found already dead. A stroke of luck that had kept their bellies full for days. By nightfall, the gentle patter had become a relentless drumming. The wind drove the rain sideways, finding every chink in the cabin's weathered planks. Jaime built up the fire in the hearth, hoping the warmth would counteract the creeping dampness. Scout shook himself repeatedly, his fur releasing the earthy scent of wet dog into the confined space. The first leak appeared just before midnight, a steady drip from a corner of the ceiling Jaime had thought was sound. He placed the dented pot beneath it, the metallic plink of water hitting metal adding a counterpoint to the storm's symphony. A second leak formed within the hour, then a third. Jaime scrambled to find containers, his cup, a hollowed piece of bark, a cracked bowl salvaged from the cabin's debris. The floor grew slick with water that found no vessel. "It's okay, boy," Jaime told Scout, as much to reassure himself as the dog. "It's just a little water. We've been through worse." The collapse came near dawn. With a wrenching groan, a section of the roof gave way, loosing a cascade of rotted timber and icy water onto the area where they slept. Scout yelped, scrambling clear just in time. Jaime was not so lucky. The deluge soaked him instantly, bringing with it scraps of sodden insulation and the tiny, shivering inhabitants of the ceiling's dark spaces. Shivering, Jaime dragged himself and what was left of his bedding to the single, relatively dry corner of the cabin. The fire had long since succumbed to the dripping water, leaving only cold ashes in the hearth. The carefully stored food, the fruit of days of effort, now sat in puddles, much of it ruined. As the gray morning light filtered through the new hole in the roof, Jaime surveyed the damage with a rising sense of despair. Rivulets of water ran down the interior walls. The floor was a shallow lake. The few possessions they owned were either floating or submerged in the rising water. Something inside him broke. The months of carefully maintained composure crumbled like the waterlogged ceiling. Jaime sank to his knees in the water, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Every loss, his mother, his home, his old life, compounded with this new defeat, overwhelming his fragile defenses. "I can't do this," he whispered. "I'm just a kid. I can't." Scout approached cautiously, nudging Jaime's hand with his wet nose. When that elicited no response, the dog pressed his body against the boy's side, a solid presence against the storm, both outside and in. Jaime wrapped his arms around Scout's neck, burying his face in the damp fur. The dog stood patiently, allowing the embrace, offering the only comfort he could. They remained that way as the storm gradually abated, as the roar of the rain softened to a murmur, then to sparse drips. It was Scout who moved first, pulling gently from Jaime's embrace to investigate something near the collapsed section. Jaime watched listlessly as the dog sniffed at a heavy beam that had fallen across their sleeping spot, right where Jaime would have been lying if the noise hadn't woken him moments before the collapse. The realization was sobering. He would have been sleeping right there. "You're right," Jaime said, wiping his face with a dirty hand. "Could have been worse." The next few hours passed in silent, determined activity. Jaime waded through the water, salvaging what could be saved, and discarding what couldn't. He pushed the water out the cabin door, using a flat piece of board as a makeshift squeegee. The sun appeared, sending weak shafts of light through the hole in the roof, illuminating the extent of the damage but also beginning to dry the saturated interior. By midday, Jaime stood in the center of the cabin, hands on his hips, assessing the situation. The hole would need to be covered before nightfall. The temperature dropped quickly in the mountains, and their soaked clothes and bedding would need heat to dry. The stored food required immediate attention to save what was left. Most importantly, the roof needed to be repaired to prevent this from happening again. Not just patched, but real structural work, beyond anything he had attempted so far. Jaime's gaze fell on the fishing line, still tucked safely in his pocket. Strong, pliable, able to bear weight beyond its slender appearance. His mind began to work the problem, considering how it could be used to lash branches together, to secure a temporary covering until a more permanent solution could be found. "We need branches," he told Scout, who perked up at the sudden energy in his voice. "Straight ones, and something waterproof." The dog tilted his head as if considering the plan. "I know," Jaime continued. "It's not going to be pretty, but it doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to work." For the first time since the collapse, a fragile resolve replaced despair. Jaime stepped outside, scanning the surroundings to gather materials. Above them, the clearing sky seemed an omen, not of easy days ahead, but of possibility. The storm had tested them, had nearly broken them, but it had failed. And on that narrow edge between breaking and bending, there was something Jaime was just beginning to recognize in himself. Resilience. Scout's bark echoed through the trees, urgent and insistent. Jaime stopped his gathering, cocking his head to place the sound. The dog had wandered farther than usual on his morning expedition, trailing some scent that had captured his full attention. "Scout!" Jaime called, dropping the armful of pine boughs he'd been gathering. The bark came again, not distressed, but distinctly a summons. Jaime followed the sound through a dense thicket of mountain laurel he had never fully explored. The brush gave way suddenly to a narrow ravine, carved out by spring runoff. Scout stood at its edge, his tail wagging with excitement, looking down at something below. Sliding carefully down the steep embankment, Jaime found himself standing before the rusted remains of an old pickup truck. The vehicle was half swallowed by decades of leaf litter and encroaching vines. Its once blue paint had faded to a ghostly patina. A sapling grew from the truck bed, its trunk emerging where the rear window had once been. "Good boy," Jaime whispered, scratching Scout's head. The dog bounced with the pride of discovery. The truck's door groaned in protest as Jaime pried it open, releasing a scent of mildew, decay, and old upholstery. The interior was a wreck. The seat cushions had rotted from the damp, raided by small animals. The steering wheel's cover was peeling away in strips. The glove box hung open, empty of anything useful. But the truck bed held promise. Beneath layers of debris lay a battered toolbox, its red paint still visible in protected creases. Jaime worked it free with trembling hands, setting it on a relatively clear patch of ground before trying the latch. It resisted at first, then gave way with a sudden snap that made Jaime stumble back. Inside, nestled in a bed of rust, lay treasures. A hammer with most of its handle intact, several screwdrivers of varying sizes, a pair of pliers, and, most valuable of all, a small handsaw. Beneath these, wrapped in the remains of an oilcloth, a box of nails had survived with minimal corrosion. Jaime let out a whoop of joy. startling a family of jays from a nearby tree. Scout joined the celebration, running in circles around Jaime and the toolbox. Further exploration of the truck yielded more rewards. A tarp was folded under the driver's seat, shielded from the worst of the weather. Though mildewed in spots, it was still largely waterproof, exactly what he needed for a temporary roof patch. A metal jerry can in the truck bed offered potential as a larger water container. Even the truck's side view mirror, still attached and surprisingly intact, would provide a luxury Jaime hadn't enjoyed for months: the ability to see his own reflection. It took 3 trips to haul everything back to the cabin. The tools alone were a reason to celebrate, but the tarp represented something close to salvation. Within hours, Jaime had it positioned over the hole in the roof, securing it with a clever combination of salvaged wire, fishing line, and strategic weights. That night, a light rain tested his repair. A few drips managed to find their way through, but compared to the previous deluges, the cabin remained blissfully dry. Jaime lay awake, listening to the soft patter of rain on the tarp, filled with a satisfaction deeper than any he had felt since finding the cabin. The discovery changed everything. With the right tools, repairs that had been impossible were now merely difficult. Projects that would have taken weeks could now be completed in days. The saw, in particular, opened up new possibilities: the ability to cut boards to specific lengths, to shape wood for specific needs, rather than adapting to what nature provided. In the following days, Jaime set up a sort of workshop on the cabin's porch. He spent hours familiarizing himself with each tool, learning its feel and purpose through trial and error. His hands, already toughened by months of survival, developed new calluses in different places. The satisfaction of driving a nail true, of sawing a straight line, of mending rather than merely patching. These became new joys in a life that had known too few. Scout, sensing the importance of the find, guarded the toolbox with a special vigilance. He seemed to understand that these strange metal objects represented security in ways his canine mind might not fully grasp, but certainly respected. A week after finding the truck, Jaime stood in the doorway of the cabin, surveying what they had accomplished. The roof, while not perfect, would hold against the next storm. The worst sections of flooring had been reinforced or replaced with boards scavenged from less critical areas. A simple shelf now kept his few belongings off the ground. "What do you think, Scout?" he asked, bending down to scratch behind the dog's good ear. "Starting to look like a real place, isn't it?" Scout leaned into the boy's hand, his tail sweeping the newly cleared floor in apparent agreement. Jaime's gaze drifted to the hillside where the truck lay hidden. What other treasures might be waiting in these mountains? What other remnants of human passage could help turn their survival into something approaching comfort? For the first time, Jaime allowed himself to think beyond mere existence, beyond the daily struggle for basic needs. He allowed himself to imagine improvements, refinements, even the occasional luxury. Not just a shelter, but a home. Not just surviving, but building. The first frost arrived like a whispered warning. Jaime awoke to find delicate white patterns etched across the cabin's few remaining window panes. The ground outside was hard, crunching under his feet. Scout's breath plumed in small clouds in the morning air. The mountains had been signaling the change for weeks. The shorter days, the leaves turning from green to brilliant reds and golds, the wild animals moving with a new urgency. Standing on the porch, Jaime watched a V of geese pass overhead, their calls fading into the distance. His thin jacket, adequate during the summer months, Now let the chill seep in. Each breath stung his lungs slightly, a feeling both invigorating and unsettling. "Winter's coming," he said to Scout, who sat alert beside him, his ears tuned to a distant sound only he could hear. "And we're not ready." The wood stove was huddled in the corner of the cabin, a cast-iron giant that Jaime had all but ignored during the warmer months. The previous owners had left it behind, likely deeming it too heavy to haul down the mountain. Its surface was stippled with rust, the door hung crookedly on its hinges, and the stovepipe that should have connected it to the chimney lay in pieces on the floor. Now, staring at the frost, Jaime recognized the stove for what it truly was, the difference between surviving the coming months and perishing in them. The next days were a blur of frenzied preparation. Using the tools from the truck, Jaime repaired the stove door, lashing it with wire where the hinges had failed. He scraped rust from the crucial joints, applying rendered animal fat as a makeshift protective coating. The sections of stovepipe required careful cleaning and fitting, but eventually formed a continuous path from the stove to the chimney. His first test fire filled the cabin with smoke, sending boy and dog retreating outside, eyes streaming. After adjusting the angle of the pipe and clearing a blockage in the chimney, his second attempt proved more successful. Heat radiated from the iron surfaces, quickly warming the cabin's interior. That night, they slept in true comfort for the first time since finding the shelter. Firewood became his obsession. Jaime had kept a small supply for cooking, but winter would demand far more. He established a daily routine. Mornings spent felling dead trees with the handsaw, afternoons spent dragging logs back to the cabin, and evenings spent cutting and stacking the wood in a sheltered area on the porch. His muscles ached constantly, but the growing woodpile was a visible testament to his progress. Food storage presented another critical challenge. The stream would likely freeze, making fishing impossible. Wildlife would become scarcer, and foraging options would dwindle. Jaime revisited his earlier experiments with smoking meat, refining his technique to extend its preservation time. He gathered every edible nut and berry still available, storing them in containers salvaged from both the truck and the cabin. The cabin itself needed weatherproofing. Using moss, mud, and strips of cloth, Jaime methodically sealed the gaps between the logs where cold air seeped in. He repaired the door so it latched more securely. For the windows with broken panes, he stretched oiled paper from an old magazine found in the truck, a solution that let in light while blocking the wind. Scout seemed to understand the urgency of the preparations. He roamed farther on his hunting expeditions, bringing back rabbits and the occasional larger game that Jaime could never have caught on his own. The dog's coat grew thicker, nature providing an insulation Jaime could only envy. His own clothing was a serious worry. The few items he owned had endured months of hard wear, growing thin in crucial spots. Using a needle and thread from a small sewing kit found in the truck's glove box, Jaime reinforced what he could. He fashioned crude mittens from a vinyl seat cover, which provided some protection from the wind and damp. The first snow came just as the last of the leaves fell. Jaime watched from the doorway as white flakes drifted down, transforming the familiar landscape into something strange and beautiful. Scout bounded through the accumulating powder, snapping playfully at the falling flakes, then returned to shake himself vigorously near the stove. That night, with a fire glowing and casting warm light across the cabin, Jaime took a mental inventory of his preparations. The woodpile would last 2 months, if managed carefully. His food stores would sustain them for perhaps half that time, requiring supplementation through hunting and trapping throughout the winter. The cabin, while far from perfect, would shield them from the worst of the weather. Would it be enough? Jaime couldn't be sure. His knowledge came from books read in another life, from trial and error, from desperate necessity. The mountains in winter were unforgiving. He had heard enough stories before he was left behind to understand that. As darkness fell completely outside, Jaime added another log to the fire, adjusting the flue to maintain a slow, efficient burn through the night. Scout curled up near him, already dozing in the radiant heat. The dog's presence had been a constant comfort through every challenge they had faced. Now, facing their greatest test yet, that simple companionship felt more valuable than all his physical preparations combined. Jaime ran a hand over the warm surface of the wood stove, feeling the promise of warmth held within its iron walls. The stove was not just a tool or an appliance, it was the heart of their home, the center around which they would revolve for the cold months to come. "We'll make it," he whispered, as much a prayer as a statement. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and relentless, blanketing their mountain refuge in the first embrace of winter. The day began like any other winter morning. Jaime fed the wood stove before dawn, the cabin's interior still holding the deep chill of the night. Scout stretched lazily near the warmth, his morning routine unhurried now that snow blanketed the mountain world. 3 months into winter, they had fallen into comfortable patterns. Mornings were for essential chores, clearing a path to the outhouse, checking the trap lines, breaking ice on the stream for fresh water. Afternoons were for cabin improvements that the warmer months had not allowed. Evenings passed in the quiet companionship of boy and dog, the firelight dancing on walls now decorated with simple carvings, and found objects that made the space uniquely theirs. Jaime had just returned from checking his traps, pleased to find a rabbit in the snare closest to the cabin. The morning sun glinted off the fresh snow, the air so crisp and cold, it hurt to take a deep breath. He paused on the porch, admiring the pristine white landscape before turning to the task of preparing the meal. Scout's sudden alertness was Jaime's first warning. The dog went rigid, ears pricked forward, his gaze fixed on the tree line south of the cabin. A low growl rumbled in his throat. It wasn't the aggressive sound reserved for predators, but it was a warning nonetheless. Jaime followed the dog's stare, at first seeing nothing unusual among the snow-laden pines. Then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure, slowly making its way up the path Jaime had broken through the trees. A human figure, hunched against the wind, moving with the deliberate gait of someone conserving every ounce of energy. Panic seized him. In almost 2 years of mountain solitude, they hadn't seen a soul. Jaime's hand instinctively went to the hunting knife on his belt, his mind racing through the limited options. Run, hide, or stand his ground. Before he could decide, the figure looked up, spotting him on the porch. A gloved hand rose in a slow greeting. "Hello there," a deep voice carried clearly through the cold winter air. "Mighty cold day for a walk." The man who emerged from the trees looked old to Jaime, perhaps 60, with a silver beard crusted in ice crystals. He wore proper winter gear, insulated overalls, a heavy pack, and snowshoes that explained his ability to traverse the deep drifts. Nothing about him screamed threat. Still, Jaime remained wary, positioning himself between the stranger and the cabin door. Scout growled again. "Hush, boy," Jaime whispered, placing a hand on the dog's head. "Good watchdog you've got there," the man observed, stopping a respectful distance from the porch. "Smart to keep your voice down. Sound travels in the winter air." He smiled from beneath the ice-caked beard. Name's Henry. I'd take off my glove to shake your hand, but I'd probably lose a few fingers to the frost. Jaime said nothing, studying the stranger with undisguised suspicion. Can't say I blame you, the man, Henry said, glancing at the sky where dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. Storm's coming in faster than I expected. Been hiking these mountains for 30 years. Should know better than to trust the forecast. He nodded toward the cabin. I don't suppose you'd consider offering a man shelter till it passes. Shouldn't be more than a day, according to the weather service. Jaime remained silent, though questions pressed against his teeth. The weather service. It was an artifact from a world he'd left behind, a reminder that beyond his mountain, a normality existed that he had all but forgotten. Henry seemed to read his thoughts. You've been up here a while, haven't you, son? His tone held no judgment, only observation. Living rough, and doing a fine job of it by the looks of this place. He gestured to the well-stacked woodpile, the steady curl of smoke from the chimney, the general evidence of care, not just survival. The first flakes of the new storm began to fall, small but dense, promising a significant accumulation. Scout whined softly, pressing against Jaime's leg. I'm not with any authority, if that's what's worrying you, Henry said quietly. Just an old man who loves these mountains enough to risk frostbite to see them in their winter coat. Whatever brought you up here is your own business. Something in the man's steady gaze, in the simple respect with which he awaited Jaime's decision, eased the tightness in the boy's chest. After nearly 2 years of speaking only to Scout, Jaime found his voice was rusted from disuse. Storm's coming fast, he said finally. You'd better come inside. Relief crossed Henry's weathered face. Much obliged. The cabin seemed to shrink with a third presence inside. Henry respectfully removed his outerwear, hanging it where Jaime indicated, and placing his boots neatly by the door. He carried a pack which he set gently in the corner, asking permission before taking anything from it. Scout circled the visitor cautiously, sniffing with intense concentration before apparently deciding the old man posed no threat. The dog settled by the stove, though his eyes rarely left the stranger. You've done a remarkable job here, Henry commented at last, looking around the cabin with genuine appreciation. Not many grown men could do what you've done, let alone. He trailed off tactfully, avoiding direct reference to Jaime's age. As the storm raged outside, an unexpected exchange began. Henry shared small luxuries from his pack. Real coffee, chocolate, a bag of dried fruit. Jaime contributed the rabbit, which they roasted on the wood stove. The conversation was halting at first, then grew easier as Jaime's long-dormant social instincts gradually reawakened. Before he left on the second day of the storm's break, Henry left an unexpected gift. A camera. Not a digital one, but an old film model with several rolls of unexposed film. To document your world, Henry explained. Some things are worth remembering. Jaime held the camera carefully, this artifact from beyond his mountain refuge, as he watched Henry disappear back into the trees, his snowshoes leaving distinct tracks that would soon be covered by fresh snow. A curious mix of relief and loss settled over Jaime. Their solitude had returned, but it was somehow changed by the brief encounter with another human life. The last of the snow melted reluctantly, retreating into shaded hollows where it would persist for weeks despite the warming days. Jaime stood at the edge of the clearing, breathing deeply. The air carried new scents. Damp earth, green things stirring, life reawakening after winter's long hold. The winter had tested them severely. Food supplies had dwindled to nearly nothing by February. The woodpile, which had seemed so substantial in November, had needed constant replenishing. Twice, storms had snowed them in completely for days, the howling winds making even the short trip to check the trap lines a dangerous proposition. Yet, they had endured. Now, with the longer days and milder temperatures, Jaime felt a surge of energy that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with possibility. Scout seemed equally affected, ranging farther on their morning walks, returning with his coat flecked with mud and the satisfied expression of a dog who had thoroughly investigated the arrival of spring. The mountains transformed daily, first with the pop of tiny wildflowers through the remaining snow, then the pale green haze of budding trees, and finally the chorus of birdsong that filled the dawn hours. It was while clearing winter debris from around the cabin that Jaime discovered it. A package, tucked into a crevice beneath the porch steps, protected from moisture by its waterproof wrapping. The small parcel could have remained hidden indefinitely had Jaime not been so meticulous in his spring cleaning. Inside, he found garden seeds, dozens of small paper packets, each carefully labeled in faded handwriting. Carrots, beans, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, corn. Some were dated 5 years back. Others were unlabeled save for their contents. They were abandoned plans, perhaps, from the previous owner, or a forgotten cache from some transition. Jaime spread the packets on the cabin table, arranging them by type. The possibility they represented was almost overwhelming. He had learned to provide, becoming proficient at hunting and fishing. But the idea of growing food, of partnering with the earth to produce sustenance, stirred something deep within him. The work began at once, using tools found in the truck. Jaime cleared a south-facing patch of land near the cabin, where the sunlight lingered longest. The soil, as he turned it, was darker and richer than he'd expected, years of fallen leaves having created a natural compost. He marked rows with string scavenged from his ever more organized collection of found objects. He dug shallow trenches with painstaking precision and planted according to the crude diagrams on the seed packets. Might not even work, he told Scout, who supervised the operation with moderate interest. These seeds are old, and I don't really know what I'm doing. The dog tilted his head, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. The days passed with Jaime obsessively checking the garden patch for any sign of germination. He rigged an irrigation system using the gutters he'd installed on the cabin to direct rainwater, supplemented by buckets hauled from the creek when needed. He built a crude fence of woven branches to deter the rabbits and deer that seemed strangely interested in his project. When the first green shoots appeared, tiny, fragile things pushing up from the dark soil, Jaime photographed them with Henry's camera. The image would be imperfect, amateurish, but he wanted to document this moment of creation. All winter, the camera had sat mostly unused, the film too precious to waste on snowdrifts and firelight. But this felt worthy of being immortalized. As spring turned to early summer, the garden flourished beyond Jaime's most optimistic expectations. Not everything thrived. The tomatoes struggled in the mountain altitude, and something underground devoured half the potato seedlings. But many plants grew with a vigor that suggested they'd always belonged there. The first harvest was ceremonial. A few young, tender carrots, their tops still feathery, their orange roots thin but sweet. Jaime washed them carefully in the creek water, then shared one with Scout, who accepted the offering politely but without enthusiasm. The taste exploded on Jaime's tongue, a combination of earth and sun, so different from the foraged foods and game that had sustained them. We grew this, Jaime said, his voice full of awe, from nothing but dirt and seed and work. With the garden established, Jaime's focus expanded to other improvements. He reinforced the north wall of the cabin, which had shown alarming signs of weakness during the winter gales. He expanded the rainwater collection system, adding a filter that made the water cleaner than his previous methods. Most ambitiously, he began to build a root cellar, a small, subterranean space adjoining the cabin where vegetables could be stored through the coming winter. The work was physically demanding, but deeply gratifying. Jaime's body, already hardened by survival, developed a new kind of strength. His hands, once soft in childhood, now told the story of his mountain life in calluses and small scars, each one marking a lesson learned or a challenge overcome. In quiet moments, usually at dusk when the day's work was done, Jaime sometimes thought of Henry, the winter visitor. Had the old man known about the seeds? Had he noticed the hidden package but left it for Jaime to discover on his own? The timing seemed too perfect to be a coincidence, but Jaime couldn't be sure. What was certain was the transformation taking place, not just in the land around the cabin, which now showed clear signs of cultivation instead of mere habitation, but in Jaime himself. He was creating, not merely surviving, building, not just existing. And in that creation, there was a profound form of healing. It took Jaime nearly a week to carve the knife from a fallen branch of mountain maple. The handle was smooth from hours of patient sanding with progressively finer stones. The blade was purely decorative, wood-shaped to look like metal, but the craftsmanship showed a remarkable attention to detail. It joined 3 other items in his small pack: a pair of neatly stitched rabbit fur gloves, a wooden cup carved with intricate patterns of pine trees, and a small pouch of dried herbs he'd discovered made a pleasant, tea-like brew. "What do you think, Scout? Worth the trip?" Jaime adjusted the pack's straps on his shoulders. The dog, sensing an expedition beyond their usual territory, circled in excitement. Henry's winter visit had provided more than company and a camera. During their talks, he'd mentioned a small general store about 7 miles down the mountain, Mason's trading post, where the fire road met the river. "Old man Everett Mason runs it. Grumpy as stale bread, but a fair dealer." For months, Jaime had mulled over this information without acting on it. The cabin and its immediate surroundings had become a sanctuary, a known world where he controlled most of the variables. Venturing beyond it meant risk, of being discovered, of questions he couldn't answer, of the authorities who might tear him from the life he had built. Yet certain needs could not be met by the mountain alone. Salt, most importantly. Matches, as his supply dwindled despite careful rationing. Perhaps a trade for new winter clothing, as his original set had been patched beyond recognition. The thought of facing another winter without these items finally overrode his reluctance. The journey took the better part of a day. Jaime stuck to game trails where he could, skirting the better-known paths where he might encounter hikers. Scout ranged ahead and behind, occasionally vanishing into the undergrowth, only to reappear minutes later with a silent all clear. Mason's trading post appeared suddenly around a bend in the fire road. It was a weathered building with a time-rusted metal roof. A single gas pump stood sentinel near the entrance, its analog dial suggesting decades-old technology. 2 pickup trucks were parked haphazardly in the gravel lot. Jaime stood at the edge of the forest, his heart hammering against his ribs. People. Real people. With houses and vehicles and connections to the world beyond the mountain. He almost turned back, but need was a greater force than fear, and it drove him forward. Scout was a reassuring presence at his side. A bell clanged dissonantly as he pushed the door open. The interior was dimly lit. The shelves were crammed with an eclectic array of goods. Fishing tackle next to canned beans, work gloves sharing space with chocolate bars. A wood stove occupied one corner, surrounded by 3 chairs where a group of men paused their conversation to watch him enter. "Help you, son?" The question came from behind a counter cluttered with boxes of ammunition. An old man, his face a roadmap of deep lines, studied Jaime with piercing blue eyes. "Just lookin'," Jaime managed, his voice rusty from disuse. "Lookin's free. Buyin's better for business," the old man said, likely Everett Mason himself. He turned back to arranging fishing lures, but his attention never fully left the strange boy and his dog. Jaime moved through the store with deliberate slowness, picking out only what he needed most: salt, matches, a small tin of kerosene, and 3 packets of needles in assorted sizes. His gaze lingered on other temptations: canned peaches, a heavy wool blanket, real coffee like the kind Henry had shared. But his meager trade goods would only stretch so far. At the counter, Jaime carefully laid his handcrafted items next to his selections. "For trade," he said simply. Mason examined each piece with calloused hands, his attention lingering on a carved knife handle. "You make this?" Jaime nodded. "Got a good hand," the old man grunted, setting the knife down. "But not good enough for all this?" "Right. What is it good for?" Jaime asked, preparing to return items to the shelves. "Depends." Mason leaned forward. "You the one staying up at the Pritchard place?" "That old cabin, about a mile up Eagle Ridge." Jaime's blood ran cold. "Don't know any Pritchards." "No need to get spooked, son. Mountain folk keep to themselves." Mason glanced at the men by the stove, then back at Jaime. "Just been wondering who was smoking that chimney all last winter. Figured it was either squatters of the bigger kind or someone with more grit than sense." The store fell silent. Jaime could feel the weight of the other men's unseen attention. Scout pressed against his leg, sensing his tension. "Good work on these," Mason said, tapping the carved items. "Take your supplies. Bring more next time. Maybe some of them berry baskets, like the one I see in your pack. My summer customers, the tourists, they love that handmade stuff." The trade complete, Jaime quickly packed his purchases and turned to leave. At the door, Mason's voice stopped him. "Boy," the old man's tone had softened. "Gets mighty cold up here come January. Stop by before then. Got some advice might help you." Outside, Jaime took a deep breath of the crisp air, a wave of relief washing over him. He had navigated the outside world without disaster. As they began the long walk home, his mind was already cataloging everything he'd seen in the store, imagining what he could trade for on future visits. In the months that followed, Jaime settled into a careful rhythm. Every few weeks, weather permitting, he made the journey to Mason's store, trading increasingly sophisticated carvings and crafts for necessities and the occasional luxury. The old shopkeeper never asked direct questions about Jaime's life, but offered practical advice in short, clipped sentences. The other mountain dwellers, a scattered handful from cabins and homesteads miles apart, became familiar figures at the store. Most showed the same respect for privacy as Mason, greeting Jaime with nods instead of questions. A few shared knowledge freely: which plants broke a fever, how to read a coming storm in the cloud patterns, methods for preserving garden vegetables through the winter. In these limited interactions, Jaime found an unexpected balance: human connection without intrusion. community without obligation. Each return to the cabin felt less like a retreat and more like a choice. The mountain was still his sanctuary, but it was no longer his prison. Scout, who had initially met every stranger with suspicion, gradually developed his own relationships. He learned to accept scraps of Mason's sandwich, to tolerate a scratch behind the ears from a wrinkle-faced woman who sold honey, and to strike up a wary friendship with the old hound that accompanied a trapper on his monthly visits. Their world was expanding, cautiously but steadily, beyond the protective walls of the cabin. The chess set gleamed in the afternoon sun, slanting through the newly installed window. Each piece had been carved with meticulous care from two different woods, pale maple for the white army, rich walnut for the dark. The king stood tallest, his crown detailed down to the finest notch. The knights had flowing manes and pricked ears. Even the pawns had their own individual character. No two were exactly alike. Jaime leaned back, studying his creation with a critical satisfaction. It was the result of 3 months of evening work, using tools that had grown more refined with each trade or purchase at Mason's store. The board itself was his proudest achievement, a mosaic of alternating light and dark squares, its edges beveled with a handplane borrowed from Carl Eriksson, whose homestead lay 2 ridges to the east. "What do you think, Scout?" Jaime set the final piece, the White Queen, in her starting position. The dog lifted his head from his spot by the wood stove, tail giving a brief, approving thump before he settled back into his nap. The chess set was more than a game. It marked a transition from necessity to art, from survival to creation. Jaime ran his fingers over the smooth, cool wood, a distant memory surfacing of playing with his grandfather on Sunday afternoons, in another lifetime. He couldn't remember all the rules now, but the act of making was what mattered, not the playing. Standing, Jaime surveyed the cabin's interior with a quiet pride. It was a world away from the derelict shell they had found 3 years earlier. The roof, once sagging, was now solid and weatherproof, properly shingled with materials hauled up the mountain in countless trips. The walls, once gapped and drafty, had been chinked and sealed, then insulated with a mixture of clay, straw, and moss that kept the heat in during winter and the cool in during summer. The floor, perhaps his greatest structural accomplishment, no longer threatened to give way under a careless step. Jaime had systematically replaced the rotting planks with new timber, some traded for, some painstakingly hand-hewn from fallen trees. The finished surface, sanded smooth and oiled with a mixture Mason had recommended, glowed with a warm amber light. Where empty frames had once gaped, proper glass panes now sat, a luxury earned through months of saving and bartering. A fully rebuilt door swung on sturdy hinges and bolted securely at night. The furniture, once limited to scavenged items and bare necessities, now reflected a growing skill. A split-log table, supported by a trestle base, dominated the main room. 3 chairs surrounded it, one perfectly sized for Jaime, one sturdy enough for a larger visitor, and one whimsically carved with paw prints along its arms, an homage to Scout. A proper bed frame had replaced the mattress on the floor, its joints carefully fitted. Its mattress stuffed with dried herbs and pine needles that Jaime replaced seasonally. Scout's bed nearby mimicked its design on a smaller scale, though the dog often preferred to share Jaime's space on the coldest nights. Shelves lined the walls, holding both practical items and a growing collection of natural treasures. Interesting stones, an abandoned bird's nest, a shed deer antler found during a spring exploration. Books took up an entire section, a prized collection gathered through trades and occasional purchases. Some were practical guides on edible plants, basic medicine, and wilderness skills. Others offered pure escape, adventures and histories for the long winter evenings. The wood stove remained the heart of the home, but it was now flanked by neat stacks of split firewood, a rack of cooking utensils hanging within easy reach, and a stone hearth extension Jaime had built to increase heat retention. Above it, a mantel made from a single piece of oak held precious items. The camera Henry had given him, now accompanied by several developed photographs, a small carved figure of a dog, unmistakably Scout, and a smooth river stone with natural markings that resembled a smiling face. Light fixtures, simple oil lamps with strategically placed reflectors, banished the deep darkness that had once made the nights a time of limited activity. A braided rug, Jamie's first attempt at weaving, added a splash of color to the floorboards. Cloth curtains, traded for a season's worth of carvings, softened the window frames. Outside, the transformation was just as remarkable. The porch had been rebuilt and extended to create a sheltered workspace for projects that required good light. A split-rail fence, more decorative than functional, marked the boundary of the yard. The garden had tripled in size, now incorporating herbs and flowers among the vegetables. A small outbuilding served as both a root cellar and a smokehouse. Rain barrels, connected by an ingenious system of gutters, collected water from the roof. A stone path, laid one flat rock at a time, led from the porch to the garden, branching off toward the outbuilding and the tool shed Jaime had built from salvaged materials. Standing in the doorway, looking out at his domain, Jaime felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond pride. This was no longer just a shelter. Every board, every nail, every carefully crafted item represented a choice to build rather than simply endure, to create beauty alongside function, to establish permanence in a world that had once been defined by loss. "We did good work," he said to Scout, who rose to join him in the threshold. The dog leaned against his leg, his muzzle now graying, but his eyes still bright with devotion. Together, they had rebuilt not just a cabin, but a life. The crutch was a crude, hastily made thing, a forked branch with a padded crosspiece lashed to the top with strips of cloth. It wobbled under Jaime's weight as he struggled from the bed to the table, its uneven end catching on the smooth floorboards. "Needs a better sanding," he muttered through gritted teeth. The pain in his leg flared with every movement. Scout hovered nearby, his usual playful energy subdued by his master's obvious distress. 4 days had passed since the fall. Jaime had been harvesting cedar boughs from a deadfall, planning to use the fragrant branches to stuff a new mattress. He'd climbed higher than usual, reaching for a particularly full section, when the brittle wood had snapped beneath him. The fall was mercifully short, perhaps 15 feet. But the landing was unforgiving. His right leg took the impact at a sickening angle, the sharp crack audible even over his own startled cry. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of agony and grim determination. He had dragged himself through the underbrush and over the uneven ground, using fallen limbs as makeshift supports, collapsing frequently as the pain overwhelmed him. Scout had stayed close, whining with worry at times, but seeming to understand the need to remain calm. That first night had been the worst. Unable to reach his carefully organized medical supplies on a high shelf, Jaime had lain on the cabin floor where he'd finally crawled, cycling between waves of blinding pain and periods of faint, gray detachment. Scout had pressed against him, providing a steady warmth as the shock set in. By morning, Jaime had gathered enough strength to assess the injury. The leg was not visibly deformed, which gave him some hope that the bone wasn't badly displaced. But massive swelling and deep bruising painted a grim tapestry of trauma from knee to ankle. Any attempt to put weight on it sent a bolt of white-hot pain shooting through his body. Now, on the fourth day, Jaime faced the reality of his situation with a rising dread. The pain had settled into a dull, pulsing throb when he was still, but sharpened to a piercing intensity with any movement. The swelling had receded slightly, revealing more extensive bruising. But most worrying was his growing helplessness. The water supply, carefully stored in covered buckets, would last another day, maybe. The firewood, normally stacked within easy reach of the stove, had dwindled to a few remaining logs, and food was the most immediate challenge of all. The pantry held staples, but fresh items had to be harvested from the garden, a journey now impossible without help. "Scout," Jaime called softly, patting the bed beside him. The dog leaped up, careful to avoid his injured leg. "We're in trouble, boy." Scout tilted his head, ears pricked. "I need to figure this out." Jaime ran through his options, each one more unlikely than the last. His nearest neighbor, Cal Erickson, lived miles away across punishing terrain, an impossible trek in his current state. Mason's store was even farther. No one would miss him. His trips for supplies were never on a regular schedule that might alert others to his absence. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Jaime faced the possibility that the very independence he'd cultivated could prove fatal. The mountain that sheltered them now isolated them when help was needed most. A sound at the door cut through his increasingly grim thoughts. Scout's ears twitched, alert but not alarmed. Instinctively, Jaime's hand reached for the rifle leaning against the bed before he recognized the particular rhythm of the sound. It wasn't a bear or some other predator, but the signature pause of Scout asking to be let in. Confusion lasted only a moment before understanding dawned. It wasn't Scout beside him, but Scout at the door. Looking back at the bed, Jaime realized his mind, clouded by pain and worry, had conjured the companion he trusted. "Come in," he called out weakly. The door, left unlatched for this very purpose, swung open as Scout nudged it with his nose. In his mouth, the dog carried a freshly killed rabbit, its body still warm. A knot of emotion tightened in Jaime's throat. "Good boy," he whispered, as Scout deposited the offering on the floor beside the bed. "Smart. Good boy." In the days that followed, a new partnership emerged between them. Scout, always intelligent, now seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation with an almost preternatural awareness. He retrieved items Jaime pointed to, dragging heavier objects across the floor with determined force. He learned to pull the water bucket under the spigot of the rain barrel, carefully hauling the full container back to the cabin. Most remarkably, he continued to hunt, bringing small game directly to Jaime's bedside with evident pride. Jaime fashioned better crutches as his strength gradually returned, allowing him short trips around the cabin. He devised a system of ropes and pulleys that let him retrieve items from high shelves without needing to stand. Each small victory over his limitations brought equal parts relief and frustration at the tasks still beyond his reach. The nights were the hardest. The pain often intensified in the darkness, combining with the fears he kept at bay during the day. What if the bone wasn't setting right? What if he got an infection? What if permanent damage left him a cripple in this isolated place? Scout seemed to sense these darker moments, pressing close, offering warmth and silent company until sleep finally came. The weeks crawled by. Jaime documented his recovery through careful measurements and notes, using knowledge gleaned from medical books traded at Mason's store. The swelling subsided completely. The bruises faded, cycling through a spectrum of purple and yellow before vanishing. He could bear weight for brief periods, though a deep ache persisted. "We're getting there, boy," Jaime told Scout one morning, as he took his first unaided step in nearly a month. The dog watched the milestone with apparent approval, his tail thumping a gentle rhythm on the floorboards. The injury had revealed vulnerabilities in his mountain existence that Jaime had never fully considered. It had also revealed strengths he hadn't known they possessed. Scout's remarkable adaptability, his own stubborn resilience, and their combined ability to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The crutch, at first a symbol of his limitations, transformed in Jaime's mind to represent something else entirely. Ingenuity born of necessity, the tools you created from what life offered, rather than what you wished you had. It was exactly what he and Scout had been doing all along. The lookout wasn't much, just a small platform wedged between three pine trees on a ridge overlooking the main approach to the cabin. Jaime had built it during his recovery, a time when short excursions became possible, but longer hikes remained beyond his strength. He reinforced the natural formation with scavenged boards, added a simple roof of overlapping boughs, and camouflaged the entire structure with pine branches. From this vantage point, he could see a quarter-mile down the valley, while remaining all but invisible to anyone below. Initially built as a hunting blind, it had become something more. A security measure, a quiet refuge, and today, an essential watchtower. Jaime lay flat on the platform, his grip tight on the old pair of binoculars he'd bartered for. Scout was crouched beside him, uncharacteristically still, as if he understood the need for absolute silence. Below, moving steadily along the creek that led to his cabin, were four uniformed figures. The first hint of trouble had come at dawn. Scout had gone rigid at the cabin door, ears erect, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Jaime had silenced him immediately, straining to hear what had triggered the alert. Distant voices carried on the morning air, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human. Multiple humans, moving with purpose through what he considered his private domain. Years of caution had forged habits that were hard to break. Within minutes, Jaime implemented the emergency plan he had developed, but never hoped to use. Scout was put on a single hand signal, silent mode, no barking under any circumstance. Essential documents and irreplaceable items were secured in the ever-ready waterproof pack. Most importantly, the cabin underwent a rapid transformation. Jaime moved methodically, taking down personal photographs, stowing Henry's camera, and the developing kit he'd spent months trading for. The chess set and other distinctive handcrafts vanished into a hidden storage space beneath the repaired floorboards. He quickly disassembled the small desk where he kept journals and educational materials, stacking the pieces to look like common firewood. The goal wasn't to hide all evidence of habitation. That would be impossible. But to obscure the duration and permanence of his residence. A temporary hunter's camp might draw little notice. A miner living alone would trigger an immediate intervention. Now, watching the search party approach through his binoculars, Jaime assessed their movements with the sharp perception of prey observing predators. Their uniforms bore emblems he couldn't quite make out at this distance. Not military. Something else. Forest or park rangers, perhaps. They moved with the methodical precision of people conducting a grid search, stopping occasionally to mark locations on maps or consult handheld devices. They were looking for someone. Jaime whispered to Scout, whose ears twitched at the sound. Not for us specifically, for someone else. Relief mingled with continued caution. A general search meant they weren't the target, but discovery would bring consequences all the same. Questions would be asked that couldn't be easily answered. His age, now 15, but small for his years, would raise immediate concerns. The absence of adults would trigger protocols Jaime had carefully avoided for 4 years. The search party drew closer. Through the binoculars, Jaime could now see details. Radios clipped to their belts. The State Forestry Department insignia on their sleeves. The weary determination in their movements. They stopped at the creek crossing, barely a half-mile from the cabin, one of them kneeling to examine something on the ground. Jaime's heart leaped. Had he left a track during yesterday's fishing expedition? No. He'd been careful as always, keeping to rock and hard-packed earth. Still, these were professionals, trained to see disturbances in the natural world that a casual observer would miss. After a brief consultation, the group altered their course slightly, heading west, away from the cabin's location. Jaime let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Scout remained motionless beside him, his dark eyes tracking the retreating figures. They held the lookout post until sundown, watching as the search party made camp in a clearing 2 ridges over. The pinprick of their campfire glowed orange against the deepening twilight blue. "We should check the cabin," Jaime whispered, though there was no one to hear them now. Scout thumped his tail once in acknowledgement, the only movement he'd made in hours. The journey back through the gathering dark required all his woodcraft. Jaime moved silently along memorized paths, avoiding the dry twigs and loose stones that could betray his presence. Scout followed like a phantom, a shadow among shadows. The cabin appeared untouched, exactly as they had left it that morning. Still, Jaime approached with caution, circling the structure completely before daring to enter. Inside, he lit a single candle, keeping it low and away from the windows where its glow might be seen from a distance. "We're okay for now," he told Scout, who finally relaxed his vigilant posture, settling near the cold wood stove. "But they'll be back tomorrow." Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by the need to check the ridge where the search party's fire had slowly burned down to embers. Jaime's mind raced with contingency plans. If they came directly for the cabin, he and Scout would retreat to the emergency shelter he'd established in a cave system a mile north. If a search plane was called in, he'd seen helicopters used in mountain rescues before, they would need deeper cover than the forest canopy provided. At dawn, the search resumed, but the team continued westward, their voices fading into the distance. For 3 days, Jaime maintained a constant vigil, tracking their movements from various observation points he'd established throughout his territory. Scout seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, obeying silent commands with flawless precision, his natural instinct for stealth proving invaluable. On the 4th day, the search party left the area entirely, leaving behind only trodden vegetation and a few biodegradable flagging ribbons that would wash away with the next heavy rain. "They've given up," Jaime said, the tension of the last few days finally easing from his shoulders as he and Scout watched from their lookout post. They hadn't found whoever they were looking for. The immediate threat had passed, but its impact lingered. His mountain sanctuary, once seemingly remote from the complexities of the outside world, had proven more fragile than Jaime had allowed himself to believe. That night, by candlelight, he made additions to his emergency plan. More caches of essential supplies in strategic locations, several memorized escape routes. Scout was trained to respond to new signals that would guide them to safety if words became too dangerous. The mountain was still their home, but now its borders felt more permeable, its protection less absolute. The smoke appeared as a smudge on the horizon, easily mistaken for a distant cloud were it not for its distinct coloration. A gray tinged with yellow, rising straight up, refusing to spread, holding its form against the clear blue sky. Jaime noticed it first from the garden, straightening from his work to shield his eyes from the afternoon sun. Scout, sensing the sudden stillness, looked up from where he was dozing in the shade. Fire, Jaime said, the single word carrying the weight of generations of mountain dwellers who understood its implications. Not the controlled burn of a campfire or brush clearing, but a wildfire, capricious, voracious, and utterly indifferent to anything in its path. By nightfall, the distant smudge had grown into a defined column, its base spreading laterally along the western ridge. The air carried a faint, acrid taste, and particles of ash occasionally drifted down like macabre snow. Jaime spent the twilight hours in his lookout, tracking the fire's advance through his binoculars, calculating its distance and direction with a growing sense of dread. Too close, he told Scout, as they returned to the cabin. The winds are pushing it this way. The mountain had taught Jaime many lessons during his 5 years in residence, but none more thoroughly than preparedness. Emergency supplies were already packed and ready, a habit maintained since the incident with the search party months before. The water barrels were full to the brim. The root cellar held enough preserved food for weeks, but the fire presented a threat that couldn't be waited out or avoided with a simple change of location. The morning brought confirmation of his fears. The smoke had thickened overnight, obscuring the sun and casting an eerie orange light over the landscape. The distant crackle of flames, consuming all in their path, was carried on the wind, punctuated by the sharp pop of trees exploding as their sap reached its boiling point. Jaime worked with a methodical urgency, Scout ever at his side. He climbed to the roof, moving carefully to clear any debris from the gutters and shingles, dousing the wooden slats with water from buckets. He laboriously hauled up his homemade ladder. Next, he focused on the perimeter, moving stacks of firewood and other combustibles away from the cabin's exterior, clearing a wider space between the structure and the forest than his aesthetic sensibilities had previously allowed. Most importantly, he worked on the firebreak. Using tools accumulated over years of trade and salvage, Jaime began to clear a defensible zone around his home. The shovel bit into the earth, exposing mineral soil that would resist embers. The rake clawed away the leaves and pine needles that could carry a ground fire. The axe and saw pruned the lowest branches from nearby trees, eliminating ladder fuels that could carry the flames into the canopy. Hour after hour, he expanded the cleared area, working outward from the cabin in concentric circles. His hands blistered, then bled, and finally grew numb. His lungs burned from the exertion and the increasingly smoky air. Scout helped as best he could, dragging smaller branches away from the clearing, staying close by whenever Jaime's exhaustion demanded a brief rest. By evening, the western sky glowed with an unearthly light. The fire had crested the nearest ridge, still miles away, but it was advancing with terrifying speed through the drought-stricken forest. Occasional tongues of flame shot skyward as particularly resinous trees ignited, now visible without binoculars. "We should go," Jaime admitted. surveying his preparations with the critical eye of someone whose life depended on their adequacy. The firebreak looked pitifully insufficient against the approaching inferno, like a child's sandcastle before the advancing tide. Scout whimpered softly, pressing against Jaime's leg, as if sensing his uncertainty. "But this is our home," Jaime continued, bending down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Everything we've built, everything we've become." The decision crystallized not as a conscious choice but as a bedrock certainty. They would stay. They would defend. They might fail, but they would not abandon it without a fight. Through the night, Jaime kept vigil, snatching moments of fitful sleep between hourly checks of the perimeter. He prepared as best he could, filling every container with water, soaking burlap sacks to smother stray embers, and positioning tools for quick access. Scout remained unusually close, forgoing his usual nocturnal explorations to stay within arm's reach. Dawn brought no relief. The sun was a weak red disk, barely visible through the smoke that had thickened to a suffocating blanket. Ash now fell steadily, settling on every surface like gray snow. The roar of the fire had become audible, even between gusts of wind, a deep, ravenous sound, unlike anything in nature. By mid-morning, embers began to fall within the clearing, carried by powerful convection currents miles ahead of the main fire front. Jaime patrolled constantly, stamping out incipient flames, sweeping hot ash from the roof, and dousing areas that seemed particularly vulnerable. Scout took to carrying one of the soaked burlap sacks himself, dropping it on smoldering spots with an incredible sense of where it was needed. The day dissolved into a haze of smoke, sweat, and desperate activity. Jaime lost all track of time, measuring progress only in small victories. This ember extinguished. That spot defended. One more hour survived. His world shrank to his immediate surroundings, all thoughts of past or future subsumed by the urgent now. Night brought the fire front itself, roaring through the forest with apocalyptic intensity. Trees became torches, then skeletons, then ash. The heat pressed against Jaime's face like a physical force, even from 100 yards away. The sound was overwhelming, not just the roar of the flames, but the chorus of destruction that accompanied it. The crack of splitting timber, the groan of roots tearing from the earth, the occasional panicked cries of wildlife in flight. Through the longest night of his life on the mountain, Jaime and Scout fought together to protect their home. When spot fires ignited in the garden, they smothered them with wet sacks. When embers piled against the cabin wall, they swept them away before they could ignite the wood. When a burning limb crashed onto the roof, Jaime scrambled up through the heat and smoke to push it off, his skin blistering from the contact. Near dawn, just as exhaustion threatened to overcome determination, the wind shifted. A subtle change at first, then more pronounced. The main front of the fire, having consumed all available fuel to the west, began to move north, and the cabin was no longer in its direct path. By morning, the immediate danger had passed. The landscape around them was transformed. Blackened trees stood like sentinels across much of the view. The undergrowth was reduced to ash, but their clearing remained an island of green in a charred sea. The cabin was scorched, but intact. Jaime sank onto the porch steps, Scout collapsing beside him in equal exhaustion. Together, they surveyed what had been saved and what had been lost. The garden was partly burned, the outbuildings damaged. The forest they knew was fundamentally altered, but they remained. Their home remained. "We did it, boy," Jaime whispered, his voice raw from smoke and effort. Scout's tail thumped once against the porch boards, a weary acknowledgement. The firebreak, that last desperate defense, had been the difference between devastation and survival. The book lay open on the table, its pages marked and annotated in Jaime's increasingly neat hand. Unlike the adventure novels and nature guides that made up most of his small library, this volume was on civics, specifically the legal status of minors in their state. Jaime had traded 4 intricately carved boxes for it at Mason's store, earning a raised eyebrow from the old shopkeeper, but no questions. Emancipation, Jaime read aloud to Scout, who listened with his customary attention from his spot by the wood stove. The legal recognition of a minor's ability to act as an adult. His finger traced the words as he read, a habit formed over years of self-education. 6 years had passed since their arrival at the cabin. Jaime's 16th birthday had come and gone with little fanfare beyond a special meal and a new collar for Scout, made from soft leather traded from a trapper. The dog, now with a distinctive gray mottling around his muzzle and eyes, remained Jaime's constant companion, though his movements had grown slower and his hunting expeditions shorter. The isolation that had once represented safety now presented limitations Jaime could no longer ignore. His knowledge, gleaned from books and occasional conversations, held significant gaps. His health, while generally good, lacked any professional oversight. Most importantly, his existence remained unofficial. No documentation, no legal status, no protection beyond what the mountain and his own ingenuity provided. The wildfire had forced a reckoning. As Jaime rebuilt the damaged structures and replanted the garden, a parallel process of internal reconstruction had begun. The fragility of his mountain life had been laid bare by the flames that had nearly consumed it all. What other threats might arise that could not be met by self-reliance alone? We need options, Jaime said to Scout, closing the book and picking up the notebook where he had documented his research. Pages of careful notes detailed the legal path to emancipation, the process by which a minor could be legally recognized as self-sufficient, granted the rights and responsibilities of adulthood before reaching the age of majority. The requirements seemed designed to exclude someone in Jaime's situation. Documented income, established residence, educational assessment. Yet each obstacle led not to defeat, but to strategic planning. Over months, he built a case that might stand up to official scrutiny. Mason's trading post provided the foundation. Jaime's handicrafts, once simple barter goods, had evolved into items sought by tourists and collectors. At Jaime's request, Mason began keeping rudimentary sales records, documenting a modest but consistent income stream. Jaime also kept his own meticulous accounts, tracking expenses and earnings with a precision that would impress a professional accountant. Education presented a different challenge. Having left formal school after the 4th grade, Jaime's knowledge was a peculiar mix of sophistication and gaps. Advanced wilderness survival skills and practical mathematics coexisted with a limited understanding of history and formal grammar. To address this, he established a rigorous program of self-study using textbooks obtained through trade and occasional purchase. The cabin shelves now held volumes ranging from basic algebra to American government. Each one worked through systematically and documented in notebooks. The residency requirement seemed the simplest at first glance. He had, without question, established a permanent home. Proving it, however, without revealing its unauthorized beginning, required careful consideration. Jaime began establishing a documented timeline through receipts from Masons, dated photographs, developed at a shop in the nearest town, and relationships with neighboring homesteaders who could, if needed, testify to his long-standing presence and self-sufficiency. The most difficult decision had been determining his narrative, his personal story. Complete honesty about his abandonment and the years spent alone could trigger interventions he wished to avoid. Yet fabricating a history would undermine his case and could constitute fraud. Jaime settled on a carefully constructed narrative that acknowledged his unusual circumstances while emphasizing his current capabilities rather than his past vulnerabilities. Now, after months of preparation, the time had come to act. Jaime assembled the documents he had gathered, recreated identification papers from memory, letters from mountain folk attesting to his character and capabilities, financial records, and educational self-assessments. These, along with a formally worded petition for emancipation, were placed in a leather folio he had made for this specific purpose. "Tomorrow," Jaime said to Scout, who thumped his tail in acknowledgement without lifting his head from his paws. "We go to town." The county seat was 30 miles away, a journey they had never made. Jaime had mapped the route carefully, calculating the rest periods needed for Scout, whose aging joints could not handle the full distance in a single day. They would travel light, carrying only the essentials and the precious documents that represented his bid for a legitimate existence. That night, Jaime stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the recovering forest in shades of gold. The blackened trunks stood in stark contrast to the vibrant new growth emerging from the ash-enriched soil. The mountain was rebuilding itself after the fire, finding new forms of beauty amid the devastation. "Maybe we can do the same," Jaime whispered. Inside, he made his final preparations. His clothes, the best he had, though still handmade or bartered, were laid out for the morning. Food for the journey waited in a small pack. The cabin was secured for its first multi-day absence, perishables properly stored, and fire hazards eliminated. Sleep came fitfully, anxiety and anticipation taking turns in his waking moments. Scout seemed to sense his tension, pressing closer than usual against Jaime's side, offering silent reassurance. Dawn found them already on the trail, moving with purpose through a forest still beautiful in its transformation. Jaime carried the folio close to his body, protected from weather and brush. Each step carried them further from isolation and closer to a world of structure, rules, and human complexity largely forgotten during their years of self-imposed exile. Yet it was not fear that drove Jaime, but something quieter. A recognition that true independence came not from isolation, but from engagement on one's own terms. The mountain had given him strength, skills, and an identity. Now it was time to carry those gifts beyond its borders. "Whatever happens," Jaime said to Scout, as they paused on a ridge overlooking the distant glimmer of civilization, "we'll face it together." The document felt heavier than its single page should allow, its official seal and formal language transforming a simple paper into something profound. Jaime laid it carefully on the cabin table, smoothing its folds with reverent fingers. Scout watched from his usual place by the wood stove, his gray muzzle resting on paws that twitched occasionally in some canine dream. "It's ours now," Jaime said softly. "Legally, ours." The path to legitimacy had been anything but simple. The county authorities had met his petition for emancipation with an initial skepticism that bordered on outright dismissal. The documentation he had so meticulously prepared was met not with ready acceptance, but with grudging scrutiny. Then came the questions, probing, occasionally accusatory, each one designed to find a crack in his narrative. Through it all, Jaime maintained his composure, answering directly when he could, and with measured deliberation when he had to. Yes, he'd been alone for years. No, and